it takes a while to bring the rest of our forces up to full strength and full readiness. So that's really what this is all about. It's not just about the arithmetic of the numbers of troops in NATO. It's about readiness and how much ammunition there is, how many missiles we've got. Even Putin, I think, has been surprised at the rate at which he's getting through bombs, rockets, and missiles. He's having to use some old Second World War stuff because he's run out of some precision munitions. And he's only fighting, in one country on a small front.
Well, earlier today, Britain's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace demanded a 10% increase in defence spending. And earlier I spoke to Admiral Sir Burnell-Nugent, a former Commander-in-Chief Fleet at the Royal Navy, and asked him how he would characterise current and maybe even reassure people.
Well, there is a sort of contradiction here because, of course, you need to prevent a third world war or a major war in Europe, even greater than the war in Europe we've got at the moment. You need to be strong, because if you're weak, you get rolled over, and of course that's what Putin's trying to do in the Ukraine. It's not going too well for him, but that's what he's trying to do. So we need to be strong. That's how you deal with bullies, is through strength, not obviously through weakness. And so we in NATO, we need to strengthen our defences at this time, because that's how deterrence works. The word deterrence gets quite confused because people think about nuclear deterrence, but deterrence is just as important in the conventional domain. And if ever there was a time where we need to strengthen our forces right across NATO, it's right now. We've got to make it absolutely clear to Putin.
But Sir James, can I interrupt you for a second? Before the 24th of February, I recall news items and discussions about NATO being the greatest military alliance the world has ever seen, and it kept the world safe for 75 years. So how much more strength does NATO need to inject?
Well, a lot of it is to do with readiness, and you'll have heard the announcement about the high readiness NATO forces being increased from 40,000 to 300,000. Your listeners might be slightly surprised to hear that not all of our armed forces and indeed NATO armed forces are at high readiness. You might think if you've got 72,000 soldiers in the British Army, or hundreds of aircraft in the RAF, or just short of 100 ships in the Navy, they're all sort of ready for war. Well, of course they're not. Some of them are training, some of them have only just joined. Some ships are in refit, some aeroplanes are being serviced, and to keep the whole of one's armed forces at a very high state of readiness, which is what we did in the Cold War, is an extremely expensive business. It requires more ammunition, more fuel, more training areas, and so on. And that's what NATO's got to do, because in the piping days after the end of the Cold War, between 1990 and really this February, NATO's readiness, although the volume of armed forces is quite high, the readiness has actually become quite low, which is why, if you might notice, when the British Army gets engaged in some crisis overseas, it's usually either the Paras or the Royal Marines who get sent initially, because they're the high readiness units, and it takes a while to bring the rest of our forces up to full strength and full readiness. So that's really what this is all about. It's not just about the arithmetic of the numbers of troops in NATO. It's about readiness and how much ammunition there is, how many missiles we've got. Even Putin, I think, has been surprised at the rate at which he's getting through bombs, rockets, and missiles. He's having to use some old Second World War stuff because he's run out of some precision munitions, and he's only fighting, in one country on a small front.
Indeed. So in that case, then,
it's crucial.
In that case, then, what to make of this news that 300,000 troops are going to be positioned on NATO's eastern flank to prop up those countries that feel under pressure because of Russian proximity?
I'm not sure actually that 300,000 troops are going to be stationed forward in quite that way. Maybe I hadn't read that. There's in a lot of places along the border between NATO and Russia and Belarus. There are troop formations, but they tend to be of the sort of regiment size, sort of 600 men, that sort of thing. The suggestion now, I think what NATO wants to do is to bring all those formations up to brigade size, which is typically 4 regiments. And again, typically they'd be mixed armor and artillery and infantry. So you've got a proper fighting combination. And yeah, I think if I was in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Romania, I'd be really pleased to hear that.
Mm-hmm. And what about the implications of all this for British military readiness? I mean, you'll have heard the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace saying I think he said there's been too much form before function, and is it knee-jerk reactions? Now, who or what is being criticised there? And what about this jump in budget spending or budgetary diversion to the MOD of 10%? Is that realistic?
Well, it may have to be realistic because this is happening in the real world. What is happening in Ukraine is realistic. Putin is realistic, and we've got to respond in a realistic way. But a lot of that money is needed for readiness. I don't know if you remember back at the beginning of the Second Gulf War. We weren't really as ready as we should be. Remember all the stuff about not big enough flak jackets to go around and things. A lot of the readiness of British armed forces is actually held in industry. It's stuff that's either on the shelf or, worse still, not even on the shelf. And there are a lot of dormant contracts and things that have to be triggered in order to raise the readiness of our armed forces, and that costs money. And of course, there's been an unwillingness to commit that money until now, and maybe there still is. But that's what's needed, is to raise the readiness of our existing armed forces. Maybe expand the armed forces, that actually takes longer. But raising the readiness is something we need to get a move on with.